Welcome to Praise, Prayer and Preaching with the Rev Dr Keith Garner, Superintendent and CEO of Wesley Mission.
An address of this kind in the context of the beginning of a year has about it that sense of charge, a responsibility that lies before us and a reminder of those things that are our priorities. For ministers, chaplains and pastors, there's an obvious focus. For church leaders and elders, critical aspects in which there is a part to play in the support of ministry. And for the whole church, as together we share in a joint sense of purpose. This is an opportunity for a new beginning. And while the summer can in fact be a time of relaxation for many people entering ministry, it's often a time of stress. People are leaving one appointment and moving to another with extra responsibilities and new responsibilities that are issued with such a move. But together, we recognize a renewed sense of collegiality, a purpose that we are united in. Let's be quite clear. Although we feel good about the work in which we engage, we are, for many people, irrelevant. For many people, what we seek to do, for the vast majority of people in Australia, is totally unrelated to the worlds in which they operate day by day. One cynic defined a philosopher as a blind man in a dark room looking for a black cat, and a theologian as the one who thinks he's found it. And I think that attitude about what it is we do is a real one that we have to face every day of our lives. We recognize the great gulf that exists between the religious and the cultural world of the New Testament and ourselves. However, we take the challenge of scriptures and try to engage with both the community and the gospel. We remind ourselves of the reading that was read to us from Mark chapter 3. In verses 14 and 15, we read, "He appointed 12, designating them apostles, that they might be with him, that he might send them out to preach and to have authority to drive out demons." In any study of the Markan narrative, you'd have to recognize that there seems to be a double dip here. For in the first chapter, Jesus walked by Capernaum, his home, and called disciples to follow him. Well, what is it that's happening here? Unless it is something different, there is no purpose of it. But there is something different. For he goes on a mountainside, having instructed the disciples to get him a boat because of the crowds that were following. And on that mountainside, he called those whom he wanted. Now, there's something about all that. I always resist selectivity when it comes to a theological understanding of what's happening in the New Testament. If it loses that sense of the all and the all together of people and community. But there is something very specific goes on here. David Hewitt, in his Bible guide, gives the popular title to this passage, "Jesus Chooses His First Team." I find that helpful because it places the disciples within a wider group. Doesn't deny that there are other callings, doesn't deny that there are many, as there are 120 by the time we open the Acts of the Apostles, doesn't deny any of that, but says here is a group that have a specific and special ministry. The initial phase of Jesus' ministry has begun, and now a new initiative is underway. Jesus, like many others that would follow, turns from the religious establishment of his day to take the message into the open air, as had John the Baptist. This is, in many ways, a strategic withdrawal. It has a real sense of purpose, waiting for the appropriate time for the ultimate conflict. In so many areas of life, proper timing is essential, but nowhere more than in the launching of Jesus' mission, and later the coming face-to-face with the events and the people that would together contribute to the journey that will lead to the cross. Several things strike me about those 12. They were ordinary by nature, not a priest or a scribe or a Pharisee among them. Secondly, and I don't know how you put this other than this, they were a mixed bag. Impetuous, ambitious, conservative, radical, and even melancholy. I'm not sure they'd be our first team choice. But they were Jesus. Yet despite their differences in temperament, background, and personality, it was the team he chose. As we stand at the beginning of a year, I sense that in any service of this kind, we are overwhelmed by the sense of God's call upon our lives. That says to us that calling is the first fundamental and prioritized calling amongst all the things that we're asked to do in life. The humility of our servanthood is measured against Jesus Christ. Phillips Brooks, who wrote so helpfully about preaching and ministry in another age, helpfully wrote about ministry in this way. He said, the true way to be humble is not to stoop yourself till you're smaller than yourself, but to stand to your real height against some higher nature that will show you the real smallness of your own greatness. Now, when I sat down and tried to get hold of that and understand it, I thought it was so helpful in ministry. The measurement of our ministry is always against Christ, always against his call in our lives. Then we see ourselves as we really are. For those stepping out in ministry, in new ministry or challenge, many wonder how it is that God could use them. I never cease to still ask that question 36 years on. I said, how is it that God can use us? But it is not for the judgment of others. It is only for the judgment of God. It is not for my analysis of me or your analysis of yourself. It is the Almighty God that has chosen in his mercy to use the words we speak and the actions we do and the people we are and the communities that we help to create to be God's calling upon our lives. Let me say a number of things. If we're to engage in the challenge of Christian ministry, there are things we should remind ourselves of. Firstly, the communion with God that you are to maintain. If we are to be effective in ministry, we have to keep in touch with God. Worship, prayer, and study are vital aspects and components of that. Our sense of working together under God and supporting each other, critical. That we are together to support one another, to build each other up, not to pull each other down. To say to ourselves, here we are as the people of God, and recognizing we need each other. Our sense of working together in that way. And Jesus called disciples to be companions and representatives. The life of the church must be marked by many things, but over and above all things must be a sense of the presence of God. We need to give priority not only to our buildings, not only to our programs, not only to the things that we've been given responsibility for, but our walk with God. The challenge of operating as we do in the many multifarious different aspects of ministry demand that we take that seriously. So it must happen that in the life of our churches and congregations, we are not simply following the pattern of another day. We have to discover and rediscover what it means to do ministry in our context. In a city centre, Sunday school might be on Wednesday. Sometimes our work with adults may have to be squozen in different ways than we've ever done before. The challenge of a city centre is unique in itself. As ministers, we must make space for God. We talk to him as well as about him. Discovering pathways of service with Christ at the centre, pressures will endanger our communion. They always have. We need time to develop our life with God. Staff meetings often need to reflect the place of devotion. I remember when I used to lead a large staff team, that I became very aware that we were crowding ourselves with the familiar routine activities which so easily took the agenda and the time, that we decided once a month we would do nothing but nurture our life in Christ. prayer, devotion were the things that took priority, and business was banned. And there's a reality where that has to happen in all our lives. Now, I can be overzealous about all of that, but it's the very conflicts that we face in understanding our ministry and the things that will pull us away from the priorities that demand that we take that kind of thing seriously. Richard Foster, the evangelical Quaker, is best known for the book Celebration of Discipline. But in his book Prayer, Finding the Heart's True Home, in that book, he used the example of Archbishop Anthony Bloom, who from a very different kind of spiritual tradition, a wonderful man, tells the story of his own upbringing, where his father had been a priest in the tradition that was his. And he used to put a note on the door when at prayer. And it said this: "Don't go to the trouble knocking. I'm at home, but I will not answer the door." Foster says he's never felt able to really do that. But he did once put up a sign that said, "In conference with the boss." And I think there is a sense in which that nurture is real. We would all recognize it, but nowhere is it needed more than if we take ministry seriously. We mustn't be embarrassed about giving spiritual priorities to our individual and our corporate lives together. So not only have we got a communion with God to maintain, we've got a commission from God to fulfill. There's a sense in which we can understand this in an especially relevant way this evening. We are together committing ourselves to ministry and service in Jesus Christ. The disciples were thrust out. When I examine these, and they are two different little sections that would be taught and read in the life of the early church. The first is, Jesus withdrew to the lake. A large crowd was following. And then Jesus went up the mountainside and just chose his team. I don't know how he did this. However I understand it, it is certainly most interesting. The disciples were thrust out, more than just sent. There would be times when they would be sent out in twos and return and feel the utter frustration of not being able to fulfill or do those things that were required of them. There was an urgency about taking the message to others. There's an urgency that has to be balanced with time for people. It's hard to believe that 52 years ago, Bob Dylan struck the note. Well, struck the note always feels wrong when I talk about Bob Dylan, really, if I'm honest about it. When he sang the song, "The Times They Are A-Changing," 52 years ago. And every year since Dylan and the coffee shops of New York in Greenwich Village, when they were singing those songs, the changes that have happened since have been utterly transforming for the world and often frighteningly alienating for the Christian church. It is an age of rootlessness. People have rejected the past as the source of inspiration and example. In a past day when people looked for examples of something that would give them stability and hope and purpose, they would look back in their history books and they would talk about the giants of history. They would talk about particular aspects. They would certainly talk about those in the church. Our daughter lives in a part of Wimbledon in London. And the road that she lived on was called Aylward Road. And I talked about that with her one day in the car. I said, "You know, this road is named after Gladys Aylward, one of the finest, greatest missionaries that ever left Britain to go to China." And I could see that there was a great moment of unrecognition. And I realized that that was just typical of a generation that we now live in. The future and the present is no longer measured by the past, however grand that past was. This is an age of rootlessness. I could spend a whole 10, 15 minutes simply talking about Roots, that American program, and all the exploration lines that go in there about history as it was. There's an uncertainty about values, a time when it seems to be impossible to find any consensus. The X-Files used to say, "The truth is out there." Well, there are many now who don't even think there's any truth out there to deal with. Now, when you begin to address that and you say, how does that relate to ministry? Well, however it has to relate, it must relate. It must make us think profoundly deeply about what it is that we are called to do. We are a people called to build a community of faith in the midst of the many communities of this world. Communities are not just questioning themselves, but are being questioned on all sides about their identity. In the 60s and 70s, which feels now like 1,000,000 years ago, sociologists were saying that institutions are breaking down. That was not all bad, because some of those institutions seemed to wield inappropriate power. But the breakdown has accelerated at an alarming rate. It's got an obvious impact upon the Christian church and ministry. But it's true for all organisations in general. I remember Carol and I being on a bus one day. It was in North Wales. And I listened to the man in front talking about his local club. He was talking about a bowling club. Do you know, I thought he was talking about church. Simply for the way he was talking about the institution. We can't get people to do things anymore. Difficult to get the committee together. Difficult to do this. And I thought, this is part of what is happening in our community and our society. We see it. The struggle to get people into the different clubs that exist, the Rotary. Even the Masons put adverts in the paper now. We have moved into a very, very different kind of world. And in that world, we have to struggle to say, how is it we can declare faith in that world in a meaningful way? How is it in ministry? Can we minister to people? People's interest in issues that affect our community are in decline. It's a sad feature that many people, if you met them, you said, what is the news story of the day? Many of us have not listened to the news. I don't buy a paper. Fortunately, some of that generation are still into soundbite and still into it at the moment, and still reading the online, whatever it is, to give them chunks of information. But the world has changed dramatically. We must remind ourselves of our calling. In the same way that the first Wesleyan revival managed to consistently hold together social and personal holiness, we must discover those two things afresh. And say, what is it about both of those things? They're not conflicting issues. They can be brought together in a meaningful way. Being concerned to look out for each other. Open sometimes to the critique of others. Knowing very well that we can never, ever, ever reach the high expectations of others. And knowing that essentially our calling begins and ends in Christ. Being concerned to look out for others leads us to putting ourselves on the line for Jesus Christ. So, thirdly, we have a compassion of God that we're meant to show. If we put them together in those three aspects, the communion with God we've to maintain, the commission from God that we're to fulfill, and the compassion of God that we are to show. We're bound together in a united allegiance. Sometimes I realize that people haven't got the ministry thing when they work separately. Because the one thing about this ministry takes us right back to the calling of the disciples. We are called together to be those who are serving God in the life and work of Christ. When our ministry is over, we'll be remembered by our inspiring sermons. And I wrote in brackets here, and our uninspiring sermons. We are recalled by our ability to order the life of the church, or our failure to do so. But we are most authentic in our ministry when we do as well as think the words of God. In contrast to the rejection by the religious leaders, Jesus is welcomed by the ordinary people of Galilee. That's another truth in here. The large crowds from the Galilee. Galilee is the north of the country. Slightly more rough and ready, slightly more combative in so many ways, and yet they listened to him. When we read in the New Testament, the common people heard him gladly, it would make sense as language for the north of the Galilee. I reckon that all of us recognize at some way the power of that truth in ministry. I used to remind people when I was a minister in the north of England, the north of England people thought the people in the south of England didn't know anything. And if they did, they were pompous in it anyway. And I used to try to help them see that it's not enough to say they don't understand us at Westminster, they don't understand us in the south. We are at our best when we're closest to those in need. And that has no locale, it has no address, it is simply the place where ministry ought to be. And the truth is that ministry and hurt belong together and everywhere. A special place for the hurt. In the ministry of Jesus, this was most certainly true. I think the last 24 hours, the imminence of the storm in Fiji, and having been in some of those places, the recognition of the fragility of homes and the devastation of what might come, reminded me of something that we did 15 years ago. We were on the island of Eleuthera and went to a small island off Eleuthera called Currant Island. And for 8 nights, I preached at a church that had been devastated by a hurricane. It was a place where it had no windows left. There was only very intermittent electricity. And there were no hymn books or Bibles. They had all been either washed or blown away. And you know, this church was vibrant. Led in vibrant ministry, because we know that when they are after you, when it's falling apart, and when everything's going wrong, the strength of God's people is shown. And you could repeat that in so many contexts around the world, where people have had to face the most difficult of things. Of course, there were many practical things that the church were doing all across those islands to help. But there was something very real about these people in the place of hurt. Hand and heart reaching out to the poor. I was given an invitation to go to a place on the Moray Firth. Now, the Moray Firth is an interesting place. It runs around the top. You don't go really to Inverness, where I went, but nearly to Inverness, where they say the purest English in the world is spoken. Whether it's true or not, who knows? But from there, right the way around to a place called Peterhead, is a large part of the coast. And it has palm trees there. It has dolphins there. And the reason for that, of course, is that the Gulf Stream that comes all the way from the south goes all the way to the top of Scotland and across. However, there are 7 vitally vibrant Methodist churches there. And I found this quite fascinating, that Scotland, which did not have more than 3,000-4,000 Methodist people, this little part of the world had them. So I explored that with the local people. Why is it that these churches are here? And the answer was this. Well, they were fishing places. They were where poor fishermen went out. And the poor fishermen had many things against them. First is they couldn't get back for Sunday church. So they were rejected by many. They often had to work in the harshness of life, and many things didn't all easily add up. And it became increasingly clear that I was in this place where these churches was because God had a special place for the poorer people in those communities. Heart and hands reaching out to people in their need. Identifying with Jesus in his sufferings. In the next few weeks, we shall move through Lent to the time when our focus will be upon the sufferings of Jesus. The anxiety of that journey that must have reminded those disciples as they journeyed with him. To respond to this, we need a spirituality that's fresh. Every leader knows the problems of handling the perennial needs of our mission. We need to give attention to God. We need to meditate upon the spiritual reality and meaning of our ministry. not only to worship, but to share with others, to read deep material. Not simply to be clever, have you done this, have you done that, but to be profoundly deep in our inquiry and following after God. Augustine's oft-quoted words are real. Work as if it all depends upon us, and pray as if it all depends on God. And you do the both at the same time. So as we begin a new year together, we remind ourselves of the whole community of Wesley Mission is about reaffirming our priorities. But for those of us in ministry, it has to be as deep as anything else. Our common sense calling, our whole of mission with a new beginning. Not concerned too much about the changes that come, but we're more concerned of the changes that ought to be happening within ourselves. Eddie Gibbs, writing on church growth, told the story that I've sometimes told at the beginning of people's ministry. It's called the ultimate chain letter. It appeared in an Anglican church newsletter from Eddie's writings. He said this: if you're unhappy with your vicar, simply have your church warden send a copy of this letter to 6 other churches who are also unhappy with their vicars. Then bundle up your vicar and send him to the church at the top of the list. Within a week, you will receive 16,435 vicars, and one of them should just about be all right. But it concludes, have faith in this chain letter for vicars. Don't break the chain. One church did and got their own man back. Within the humour again is the fact that we know that our sense of calling and ministry is offered to God. We are far from perfect. Every one of us, wherever we sit or stand, we are far from perfect. But we are called in Christ. And never have we needed more to affirm each other's ministry than today. We can become saturated with church activities and church thoughts. But in point of fact, we're engaging in a world of need. Let's work with what we have. Let's offer who we are. And let's eagerly seek to serve the Lord. As those who are engaged in ministry, pastoral care in many different ways, and chaplaincy, we're committed to a high calling. And we affirm that ministry in each other and offer our gratitude to God for the privilege of working together in his service.